Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are now on the second last agenda item of the Digital Banking Symposium, organized by Singapore FinTech Association and the Banking and Financial Services Union. The topic we'll be discussing next is cyber risk to digital banking, likely attack scenarios, and defensive insights. The financial services industry has always been a key target for cyber criminals, and digital banking is no exception. Steve Ledzian, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer, APAC of FireEye, will be sharing some real-world incidents, trends in the overall threat landscape, and conclude with some advice and insights on how to stay cyber safe. And without further ado, I will now hand my time over to Steve.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Ledzian. I'm from FireEye, and I'll be presenting to you on cyber risk and digital banking. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. First, this presentation is done in collaboration with Singapore Institute of Management. I'd like to thank all the organizers for the opportunity to be able to speak with you today as well. In case you haven't heard of FireEye, let me just give you a brief introduction to who FireEye is. FireEye is a cybersecurity firm with over 9,000 customers worldwide in over 100 countries. Our Asia Pacific headquarters is here in Singapore, where I'm presenting from. And we have customers in almost every vertical and industry, certainly finance and fintech being important customers for us. One of the differences from FireEye and other cybersecurity companies is that in addition to selling solutions which help prevent cyber attacks on organizations, we're also very well known for responding to organizations who have been the victims of cyber attack and helping them understand what happened in that attack and, more importantly, what to do about it. From that, we gain a lot of knowledge on how attackers operate, what their tactics, techniques, and procedures are. So before we talk about specifically digital banking, we need to understand a little bit of the fundamentals of a cyber attack. So this will be a slide on sort of cyber attacks 101. And what it is attacks don't happen all at once like they do in the physical world. In the digital world, attacks happen in stages. And so what you see here are 6 circles. Each circle is a stage, and I'll just walk through them very quickly. The first stage is initial reconnaissance, where the attacker studies the victim. They might do this on Facebook or LinkedIn, collecting information about that victim, understanding them, and understanding the likely targets which might make for a good entry point into that organization. The second stage is initial compromise, and that's where they break into the organization. In many cases, this is being done through email today. Most organizations allow email in, and so a malicious email with either a malicious attachment or a malicious link is enough to get the attacker, or what's called initial compromise, or the first point of intrusion within the victim organization. Once they're inside, they establish a foothold so they can reliably come into and out of the organization without having to rely on those emails. And then they do something I think most organizations don't anticipate, is they stop using malware, because malware is noisy and easily noticed, and they prefer to use stolen passwords. So the fourth stage there is to escalate privileges, or in some way steal credentials or privileges that allows them to operate inside of the organization without necessarily using malware. Once they have those access rights, they then need to find the important targets, because generally, remember where the initial compromise happened. It happened on a machine that was reading email, and generally machines that are used for reading email aren't important servers, which are the types of machines attackers want to get to. So they're starting from this point of email, laptop, or desktop machine. And the fifth stage is they'll do internal reconnaissance. They'll figure out, okay, well, where are the important assets and servers within this organization? From there, they'll move laterally, moving to those servers, maintaining persistence along the way, and they may iterate across that as they move across network segments. And ultimately, they complete their mission. And the mission completion can be stealing information, deploying ransomware, any number of outcomes the attacker might desire. So all this takes time. It's done step by step. Different tools are used for different steps. Different tactics and techniques are used for different steps. And you want to think of these steps as building blocks by which the attacker is stringing these together. And there's many different ways to achieve each one of these stages. So they have lots of options to choose from. And from those options, they string together a full attack. And that's what almost all modern cyber attacks look like today. So we need to understand, when we hear the word breach, when a company gets breached, what does that really mean, right? And in cybersecurity, what it really means is the attackers achieved initial compromise. They've breached the perimeter. They've intruded. Intrusion is another good word to describe what's really happening when an organization gets breached. They've intruded into the organization, and now they've achieved initial compromise. And where people often get tripped up is they think that once you're breached, there's impact, right? Once the attacker is broken in, and because they see, rather than seeing this attack life cycle, this chain of building blocks, they see attacks being something that happened all at once. They think, well, if I'm breached, then there's impact. And that's not necessarily correct, right? The impact is actually when the attacker completes the mission. And so even after breaking into the organization, there's a lot of work that the attacker has to do. And the attacker is doing that work now on that victim organization's home turf, where they might be more easily noticed when they're trying to achieve that initial compromise in the first place. So this is a second opportunity to stop that attacker, even after being breached, before there's any impact. Right? So that is how to think of modern cyber attacks today. Now let's try and apply this to some case studies, and let's look at a case study with a digital bank. So this is a digital banking company. They're a US digital bank. They're founded in 2016. They've done very well. By October 2019, they had a $1 billion valuation. At that time, I think it was about 4 million users, and certainly grown since then, right? So a very successful digital banking organization. They were impacted by a breach, and they had an attacker achieve that mission completion, the last stage. And the attacker's goal here, their motivation, was to steal information. And they stole 7.5 million records containing the following things: first name and last name, email address, phone number, date of birth, physical address, gender, profile information, and other information as well. And this is a problem because attackers use this information. They can either sell it online to other criminals, and that can result in fraud or impersonation. And so it's a real problem for the customers of companies who suffer these data breaches. And we'll talk in a few slides about what this organization did to try and address that problem. So this is an example in a cybercrime forum. There's many of these cybercrime forums on the internet where threat actors exchange information, exchange credentials or access to companies they've already achieved initial compromise on, exchange stolen intellectual property. And so here's the screenshot from that forum showing the actor selling this information, the 7.5 million records, to other threat actors. And we've redacted all of the sensitive information here. And as I mentioned, there's more than just one of these forums. There's many of these forums. So this is yet another forum and yet another threat actor who's selling the very same information. So I believe the first one was in June, and then the second one was in July of this year. So what did the digital bank have to say about this? So I've redacted the information. The point isn't to shame a victim of a cyber attack, because they are victims here of a crime. The point is just to understand what we can learn from them. So what they said is, as the result of a breach at one of their partners, the digital bank's partners, and at this point in their press release, they said this is now a former partner of that digital bank. A malicious party recently gained unauthorized access to certain user data at the digital bank, including passwords that were stored in hashed form using bcrypt and industry-recognized hashing algorithms. So if you don't know what hashing is, just think of hashing as encryption. You need to be able to store passwords so you can check to see if the password is entered by the user is correct or not, have something to compare it to, but you don't want to store the password in plain unencrypted text, right? So the passwords are hashed as a way to protect them should they be compromised. So they go on to say the stolen information also included some personal user information, including the types of informations that I pointed out to you in the previous slide. And they pointed out, importantly, this did not affect bank accounts, numbers, credit card numbers, or records of financial transactions, right? So when these breaches happen and these threat actors try and make this information available on the dark web, today many media organizations are monitoring those dark web forums as well, so that they can find who are the organizations that are being breached. And it's really not in control of the victim organization as to whether or not their breach becomes public anymore. It's really up to the threat actor, right? But by posting on these underground forums, it essentially ensures that it will, in fact, become public. And there's lots of things that are sold on these forums, right? So PII, or personally identifiable information, is one of the very common things you see being sold. And it's quite common. You'll see, very, very often, these postings and advertisements from threat actors. But that's not the only thing they sell. Sometimes attackers divide up that work across the attack lifecycle that I walked through, those 6 stages. So it might be that an attacker is not specialized or doesn't have the skill set to string together all of those stages. It may be that they're specialized only in one of the stages, maybe initial compromise. And so what they can do is they can achieve initial compromise, they can steal some credentials, and then sell those credentials on the underground forum in order to make a profit without having to go through the full attack lifecycle. So just as there's stages of attack, you might be dealing with a different threat actor across those varying stages, as there's handoffs from stage to stage in the underground forums as well. Intellectual property is another thing you'll see sold on the dark web forums as well. And I think another interesting thing to consider is that this was a third-party threat. So it wasn't the digital bank here that got directly breached. It was one of their technology providers. I believe it was an analytics firm. So, certainly digital banks don't do everything themselves. They outsource things like analytics to third party. And of course, those analytics, in order to work, they need to see the data. So the data needs to be shared with them. And certainly we see third party or compromises through a partner organization or a vendor happening quite often as well. A lot of times the larger organizations spend more on cybersecurity and do a good job protecting themselves. However, some of the smaller providers to those large companies might not have the same resources and might not be able to protect themselves as well, and might invest less in cybersecurity. And so they, in some way, become easier targets for the attackers coming through those third parties to the ultimate destination that the attacker wants to get to. So what did this digital bank do as corrective action, right? So, well, one thing they did was they stopped working with that third-party service provider, which was breached. And that's an important thing as well, because what we're seeing now is many organizations are choosing very carefully what providers they work with and making cybersecurity part of the selection criteria for the technology vendors they partner with. How good is your cybersecurity? Because if you're breached, that breach can extend to my organization as well. And so there's a lot of due diligence and inspection around how much effort, how much thought have you put into cybersecurity when that vendor selection process is happening. They forced a reset of all the customer logins and credentials, requiring those customers to change their passwords. So they're able to do that on their platform, but a lot of people I know struggle with passwords. They're very hard to remember. You've got so many accounts. And so a lot of times people reuse passwords on different platforms. And attackers know that, and attackers take advantage of it. So a forced reset on the digital platform, digital banking platform itself is good, but it might have also exposed other accounts where the same people use the same passwords for other internet-based services. They placed additional security measures or security controls in place. The next one's very common when there's a breach. A lot of time, the organization who's the victim will extend complementary identity theft or fraud inspection for a certain amount of time for those customers, because in many cases that's the ultimate goal of the threat actors, is to steal this information and use it for fraudulent purposes. And of course they apologize to their customers as a result of the breach and the loss of data. So that's an interesting breach. I wanted to share one other interesting with you as well. This was tied to an initial coin offering. And this one happened a little bit longer ago, but I think stands out really well in showing, in many cases, how these breaches happen. A lot of times when you're talking about fintech, you have this perception of, oh, we're using the latest and greatest algorithms, we're using blockchain, it's distributed, decentralized, it's using cryptography. It's going to be very hard for attackers to try and break that and take advantage of it. And I would say, those thoughts are generally true. But what happens is attackers don't directly attack those technologies. Instead, they find ways to go around them. And that's very much, in fact, the hacker mindset, is finding creative ways to solving problems to get things done that you want to be done. And this is a great example of that. So this was a $7 million fintech hack. And what the attacker did was very creative. So here this company was trying to raise funds, doing an initial coin offering. And I'll just read the text to you here. It says, they plan to raise capital by selling their own digital tokens in exchange for the cryptocurrency Ethereum, which is similar to Bitcoin. But just 13 minutes into the token sale, which began at 9 a.m. on Monday, an unknown perpetrator hacked the website and changed the address for sending the investments to a fake one. The company later announced on its website, and this diverted millions of dollars in contributions to the attacker. Right? So essentially what happened was, this organization tries to raise money, they were taking investments, they put the address for the deposits, the digital wallet, on their website. And the attacker didn't have to break the blockchain. He didn't need to break cryptography. All he needed to do was break into the website. Once he broke into the website, he just changed the web page so that instead of the wallet being a wallet which pointed to the company, it was his own personal wallet. And as investors were investing money, they were investing into that attacker's wallet. That's a pretty straightforward attack. All that you really need is the ability to do a website defacement. And we see website defacements all the time. So it's not that the attacker here was breaking in to that digital technology, the latest and greatest. He was just, in fact, breaking in to a website. Yet the effect was very effective. $7 million was the takeaway for the attacker here. So those are some examples, specific examples in digital banking. And one of the, I would say probably the most impactful attack over the last year, over 2020, when it comes to cybersecurity, has been ransomware attacks. And ransomware is attacking, it's a problem for every organization, whether you're in education or healthcare or finance or telco. And so I wanted to spend some time talking about ransomware as well, because it really is the #1 problem for 2020. explain to you what's happening with ransomware. The ransomware of 2019 is very, very different than the ransomware that we're seeing today in 2020. The old way of sending out ransomware would be almost like spam. An attacker would start with email and put a malicious attachment or a malicious link which pointed to ransomware. And whenever the victim opened it, that machine where they were reading that email would become infected with ransomware. The ransomware would encrypt their files and make their files inaccessible to them. And the attacker would demand a ransom or a payment in order to return access to those files. Okay, so that's very much how the old style of ransomware was working. Today, the attackers have changed their tactics. And so today what they do is they still start with email-based attacks. It's that same attack life cycle that we walked through. But instead of mailing out ransomware, they're mailing out intrusion malware. And so when the victim opens that malware, the attacker achieves initial compromise. And from there, the attacker steals passwords, and they move laterally, and they find important servers. They're within the network. And so sometimes this is called human-operated ransomware. And what this allows them to do, it allows them to deploy the ransomware on more important servers, right? Because remember, that machine where the email is being read, old 2019 ransomware used to run, it probably doesn't have a lot of important data on it. But by breaking into the network and getting access to the servers, not just one server, but all the organization's servers, we can do a lot more destructive attacks. And as a result, the threat actors are charging much, much higher ransoms. So, last year there were ransoms in the hundreds or thousands of dollars. Today, the ransoms are in the millions or tens of millions of dollars because the attackers are targeting much more important assets to the business. So this is the difference between a malware-based intrusion and a human-based intrusion that uses that full attack life cycle that we talked about. And remember when I talked about the attack life cycle as well, right? So the malware gets them into the organization, gets them the initial compromise stage, and the hackers are using malware. But once they're inside, remember, they stop using malware, and they prefer to use stolen passwords, but they also prefer to use system administration tools. So these are things like RDP or PowerShell or WMI, and the attacker will use that, but these things are also used by the IT admins. So now the problem is a lot harder because defenders used to have to just look for malware, and malware was always bad. Whenever you found it, you knew it was bad. But today, you have to also look for these tools. And the tools are sometimes bad. It depends who's using them and what are they using them for. And so that's a much harder detection problem. You have to determine the intent by which that tool is being used. All right. So the lesson learned here is that, again, detection has gotten a lot harder. Identifying malware is not just enough. And there are certainly a lot of organizations that are very focused on a malware hunt. But remember, if you're looking for a malware hunt, you're really just addressing that first stage of the attack life cycle. You're not addressing the later stages because the attacker isn't using malware in those later stages. And so in order to address all of the stages of the attack, you need to be able to identify legitimate tool use versus misuse of those tools. This problem of ransomware has gotten a lot of attention at the board level. So this was a report in April of 2020, and it said a growing number of public companies started listing ransomware as a forward-looking risk in their SEC documents. The SEC is the Security and Exchange Commission. It's a financial regulator in the United States, and over 1,000 companies are talking about ransomware as a risk in their annual reports. And that was at the start of this year, and that was, I would say, very good foreshadowing because the second half of the year, ransomware has been, again, probably the #1 problem when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, one of the advantages, rather, of an attacker breaking in is in the old way of doing ransomware, when the victim opened the email attachment, they were immediately affected. And so it wasn't really in the control of the attacker as to when the trigger was being pulled on the ransomware. The trigger was pulled whenever the victim opened the email. Today, it's very different. The attacker is inside the network, and so they get to decide when that trigger gets pulled. And so there's a question of, well, from the time of the breach or the intrusion into the network, how much time before the attacker moves across those later stages of the attack lifecycle and pulls the trigger on the ransomware? And the answer is, well, it depends. It's very diverse. But for 75% of the incidents we've seen, and remember, we respond to many of these cyber intrusions, many of which are ransomware, 75% of the incidents, at least 3 days pass between the first evidence of the intrusion and the ransomware deployment, right? So that's a good amount of time to be able to notice and stop the attacker in your network. But again, in order to do that, you have to be looking for more than just malware. You have to be able to identify tool misuse and credential misuse. And of course, when the attacker has the ability to decide when that trigger gets pulled, when the ransomware gets deployed, when do you think they'll deploy it? Well, they deploy it at the most inopportune time for the victim. So 76% of the incidents we've seen, this ransomware trigger was pulled outside of working hours. So that's either on a weekend or after normal work hours. And that just reduces the ability of the organization to respond quickly, increases the amount of confusion, increases the amount of disruption, increases the amount of time in which they can spread to multiple servers, and so is in the advantage of the attacker as well. So that's the first trend. The second trend in ransomware, and this one's probably even more concerning, is that ransomware actors are now adding extortion to the mix. And well, you might say, isn't ransomware already extortion? And in some ways it is. You're extorting the victim and saying, I will not give you back access to your files until you pay the ransom. But now what ransomware actors are doing is they're doing something additional. They're saying, wait a minute, we've already broken into the organization. We've already found the important servers. We've already gotten access to those important servers. And we're just about to deploy the ransomware on those important servers, which contain the important data. We already have access to that important data. Why don't we steal it and threaten to make it public, right? And that way, when the threat actors extort the victim, they're not extorting in one way, they're extorting in two ways. They're saying you won't have access to your files and your sensitive files, which could be your customer data, could be stolen PII information, could be an executive's emails, could be your chief legal or general counsel information, HR information, salary information, whatever the access the attackers are able to achieve, they'll threaten to make that public. And so, again, the breach information isn't in control, or the breach disclosure isn't in control of the victim, it's in control of the attacker. The attacker is using that as leverage to extort a higher payment out of the victim. And so 2020, we've got a lot of new normals we're trying to deal with. This is yet another new normal. Ransomware before, if you were hit with ransomware, the impact was a service disruption. It meant that you and or your customers couldn't get the digital assets you needed in order to get your work done or in order for your business to function. In many cases, in those old days, when companies were breached, you would see them specifically point out a statement in the press release saying, yes, we were a victim of ransomware, yes, there was a disruption, but there was no evidence that data was stolen. And they want to be able to say this because they want to avoid any sort of legal consequences, any sort of regulatory consequences. And the attackers have figured out that those consequences are exactly the things to attack if you want to demand a higher ransom. And so now they've taken that control away from the victim, and they're saying, we have your data, we'll make it public. And so today, if you're the victim of a ransomware attack, it's very likely that that is going to be a data breach, not just a service disruption. Okay? So the lesson here is the attacker is in control of that breach disclosure. Right? A lot of organizations wanted to restore from backups, keep the breach quiet in some way, not have the bad press, but that's no longer the choice for modern ransomware victims. It's the attacker who controls the disclosure. By the way, speaking of backups, right, the backup helps with the first problem only. It helps with the problem of my files are encrypted. Oh, okay.
Hi, Steve. Sorry, we will need you to present the slides. We lost the slides.
Oh, you lost the slides. Okay. Let me see if I can. Were you seeing the slides? Oh, yeah. Okay. Let me share screen again. Okay. Are you able to see the slides now? I'll take it. Yes. If you're unable to the slides, please just jump in and interrupt me again. Otherwise, I'll continue. So I was saying backups, right? So backups, the attackers, if they encrypt your files, you can get a way out by restoring from backups. You don't need to decrypt, you can just restore from backup. So the backups save you in that regard. But when a threat actor is threatening to make your information public because they've stolen it, a backup doesn't save you anymore, right? The attacker still has that information. And often it's the legal consequences, regulatory consequences, which are more serious. So in these new ransomware attacks, backups aren't even as much of a resolution as they used to be. So we've seen threat actors do some pretty interesting things. They've threatened to share data with the news and media, specifically local news and media of the country. They go to the effort to figure out who those are and share it so that the news of the breach for the victim becomes more widespread. They've specifically threatened to share stolen information with the victim organization's regulators. We've seen them threaten to share information even with the victim organization's customers and partners, saying that, look, this organization that you're doing business with had a data breach. Here's the evidence of the proof of that breach. And again, that causes leverage and increases the likelihood that that organization might consider making a payment. And then we've even seen threat actors threaten to steal, or rather share that information with competitors. So if they've stolen intellectual property, threaten to share that key intellectual property with that organization's competitors. So what are some recommendations, right? How do you address this? Well, I think you have to look at that full attack life cycle, not just malware, right? And so it is not just a technology defense. You need to think about, yes, architecture and security controls, but you also need to think about response and crisis communications. And lastly, recovery, right? When and if this happens, how do you address it? So there are cybersecurity services that organizations can avail of to help be better prepared for these sorts of attacks. There's also things that you can do technically. Not everything is a security control. Not everything is an appliance or a security service. Some things are just best practices, configurations. And so my organization, FireEye, shared this white paper. It's a freely available white paper called Ransomware Protection and Containment Strategies. And what it is very specific, not just information like, be sure you have backups, but information that help all sorts of organizations better protect themselves based on the tactics that we see threat actors using. And so this is publicly available. And if you're technical and interested in the technical aspects of cyber threats, I've put a QR code here that you can snap that'll take you to this white paper. Okay, so what are some insights and lesson learned? One thing we've seen is that breaches are inevitable. Sometimes there's an engineering mindset saying that, well, breaches sound like a technical problem, and for every technical problem, there's a technical fix. And that's sort of the intuitive, common sense thinking about cybersecurity problems. But all you have to do is look at the headlines that have, been plastered across all the journals and newspapers to see that it is not that simple. A motivated attacker, a sophisticated attacker, given enough time, will breach or will intrude on the organization. If your cybersecurity is very good, you can prevent some of those attacks, some of those intrusions. If you've invested really, really strongly, maybe you can even prevent most of the intrusions, but you can't prevent all of the intrusions. Eventually, an attacker will get in. But the important thing to realize is what I mentioned earlier. Just getting in doesn't mean that there'll be business impact. You still have a second window of opportunity to stop the attacker, and you can do that while the attacker's on your home turf. So there's advantage now, in many ways, lies with the defender. Your adversary is a group of humans, not malware. And so this one's important. So many times we see organizations who put a lot of effort into detecting threats. They'll find that threat on a machine, and then they'll immediately go to re-image or reinstall that machine to wipe the malware off of the machine, or restore it to factory defaults. Well, the problem with that is you're only addressing the malware. You're not addressing the human aspect. Think back to that kill chain. Right? If the attacker had enough time on that machine, what would they have done? They would have stolen passwords. Well, how does re-imaging or reformatting a machine stop an attacker who has a stolen password? It doesn't, right? And so it's always important to understand that there's a human behind that malware, and they're using more than just malware. Attackers will always evolve, and there's no end state in security. So cybercrime is big money, and attackers invest. They're very well organized. And so a lot of times executives of corporations will say, it seems like every year we just invest more and more in cybersecurity. When does it end? And the answer is it doesn't end. It's a cat and mouse game. And the attackers absolutely will innovate. And as a defender, your choice is to innovate faster than they do or fall behind them. Those are the options. And, again, the stakes are high. Attackers are netting millions or tens of millions of dollars here. They are absolutely motivated to innovate, come up with new attacks and new approaches. The achievable security objective. So I've said this one 2 or 3 times. I'll repeat it one last time. No business impact resulting from a cyber attack. And so the idea is if you tell your board of directors or your CEO as a security defender, I never want to be breached. We're putting in things, putting in security controls to make sure we don't get breached. They'll love to hear that. That's good. But the problem is that's not realistic because breaches are inevitable. Instead, make the security objective no business impact resulting from a cyber attack. That means that breaches will occur from time to time. However, when they do occur, you notice them quickly and you respond to them quickly before there's any business impact. That is an achievable outcome. That's what defending organizations should be aiming for. Speaking about noticing quickly, one of the things when we help victims of cyber attacks, one of the things those victims always ask FireEye is they say, FireEye, today we got the bad news that we're the victim of a cyber attack, but we know that the attacker didn't break in today. They didn't intrude today. They came in sometime earlier. And so our question is, how long have these attackers been in our network without us knowing? How long has the attacker been present and gone unnoticed? So I'll just ask you all in the audience, think about that, right? What would you expect the amount of time it would take the average organization, upon having a successful cyber intrusion to notice that intrusion? Right? Just think of a number in your head on how long that might take. The answer on average is 54 days, almost 2 months, to notice that intrusion, that stage 2 of the attack lifecycle, the initial compromise where the prevention fails. Once that happens, no one notices for 54 days on average in Asia Pacific. That's a measured number. All of the incident response, all the victims of cyber attacks that we help, every year we release a summary of learnings and insights and statistics about those breaches in a report called M-Trends. And we track this number, which we call dwell time, in that report every year as well. And so M-Trends 2020, the number was 54 days. So the good news is the number is on the decline. Previous years, it was well over 100 days. So organizations are getting significantly better at noticing when their prevention fails, but there's still a long way to go. 2 months or 54 days is still too long for intrusions to go unnoticed. And we'll talk at the end about how to address some of that. Another thing to consider is that technology alone will not save you. So a lot of times organizations think, well, I'll just buy some security control or an appliance or a cloud service, and then that'll take care of the cybersecurity problem for me. Well, technology is an important component of cybersecurity defense, but it is not everything. Remember, you're going up against humans, and you need human defenders against human attackers. And so there's a number of things you can do around cybersecurity services in the digital banking or any industry in order to be able to have a more balanced defense. And the first is something called red teaming. So if you want to win a fight, you better do some sparring, right? So many organizations buy all the kit, buy all the gear in terms of cybersecurity defense, and then never actually take it to war, never actually test it. Also, the red team is an idea of testing those security controls. It's about hiring a security firm which is not malicious to come in and test and see if they can break in against the security controls you've procured and against however you may have configured them. Right? And this isn't to embarrass you or embarrass the organization. It's about learning. It's about building muscle and getting better. And so red teaming is one of the things we've seen a lot of organizations do to great effect, which isn't buy yet another piece of technology, yet has the outcome of improving their overall security posture. Another thing is tabletop exercises. Right? So one thing to realize is that when these cybersecurity incidents happen, they don't impact the IT department. They impact the business. The consequences impact the business. And in a lot of times, as the attacks are ongoing, there need to be business decisions which need to be made. And when you're faced with these decisions, you don't want to be thinking about them for the first time in a real-world incident. You want to be practicing them in a role play before they happen. Now, I know that businesses do this for all sorts of other risks within their organization, and it's important to do this for the cybersecurity risk as well. One of the important things to do as well is to have an incident response firm on retainer. Right? Again, when you're breached, when you're the victim of an intrusion, it's often very hard to understand what happened. Right? There's no one physically present. The attacker isn't physically present. They're not telling you what their motives are. Everything is largely invisible. And so it's very hard to get to the answers of what happened and what to do about it. And there's firms that specialize in this. And you don't want to be negotiating terms and conditions on a service contract in the middle of a crisis, right? So get those firms on retainer ahead of time, get those terms and conditions ironed out, and then you can activate them in a moment of crisis when you need to, without having to go all through the legal procedures and processes. And I mentioned dwell time as well. One of the ways to to think about dwell time is, well, wait a minute, if it takes the average organization 54 days to realize that they've been breached, could that be me? Could I have an attacker in my network without realizing it? And a compromise assessment is an assessment which answers that question. It combs through the inside of the network looking for intrusions and will tell you if you have presently or have had in the past an intrusion that you didn't notice. So what are some final thoughts and recommendations? I think it's important to realize that the digital assets are your business, at least in the case of digital banking. It's very important to protect them against what are today very sophisticated cyber threat actors. It's important to monitor the dark web, right? If you are the victim of intrusion, monitor those dark web forums. And this isn't something you have to do individually yourself. Again, there's services that will do this for you so that you know very quickly if your data is being bought or sold on one of these forums. Understand the trends from your peers being breached with cyber threat intelligence. So cyber threat intelligence is all about making good decisions when it comes to investment or responding to security incidents. And if some of the things that I talked about today surprised you in terms of ransomware, those are the things that cyber threat intelligence help to inform businesses with. So that they understand the risks, they're prepared for them, and they can better react to them. And then the last one ties back to the dwell time, right? Noticing intrusions is not easy, right? The evidence is 54 days. Yes, you can do a compromise assessment to see if you're compromised without knowing it, but as soon as that assessment's done, if you get breached again, then you have a problem. So Gartner, one of the industry analysts, created a space called MDR, Managed Detection and Response. And this service is largely all about noticing if you have a prevention failure. And so even that can be outsourced. So a lot of the security measures that you take are not just technology focused, appliance focused, cloud focused. A lot of them are very much about expertise and about outsourced services as well. So I just wanted to throw up this last slide. Feel free to contact either me at FireEye or Joan at SIM. They'll be sending out an email for programs related to this, skill set improvement programs or reskilling programs related to this industry. You should be receiving those in your email. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer in the last 10 minutes or so any questions you might have. So while you type those in, I'll bring up the question and answer panel and try and answer them. Okay. Let me see if we have any questions here. Okay, question, does SIM offer part-time degrees in cybersecurity or fintech sector? So maybe I can pass to one of my colleagues at SIM if you're able to answer this question, or if not, I'll move on to the next one. Okay, so there's an answer in the chat right below. It says, currently, SIM is only offering full-time degree program in cybersecurity. However, reskilling programs catered for this industry will be sent to your email. Stay tuned. Okay. And I'm scanning for other questions. Another question is, would it help if we took CISSP? So I think if you're starting a career in cybersecurity, a CISSP, if you don't know, the CISSP is a certification. And it shows employers that you have a fundamental understanding of the concepts around cybersecurity. It is good to do. I would say that needs to be balanced with real-world experience and hands-on experience as well. But certainly, if you're planning on a career in cybersecurity and you have the time and inclination to look for certifications, CISSP is a great certification to look at. Does FireEye have an online academy? So we have a number of things that we do to help train the public. So some of those are paid courses, and you can go to the FireEye website, www.fireeye.com. You can navigate to the training section, and you can see some of those paid courses. Some of those paid courses are around our products, but some of them are skill set, like how would you do incident response? How do you do forensics? And so they aren't necessarily tied to products, they're more skill set. So you can find those there. If you're looking for things you don't need to pay for, I would say that FireEye has a channel on a website called Bright Talk. Bright Talk is on-demand videos, and I believe you can set up an account there without any cost. And FireEye has many videos, and so a lot of the things that we talk about are what's happening in cybersecurity, what's happening with cloud, and you can get a pretty good education, I would say, or at least a taste of whether or not cybersecurity resonates with you, and if you have interest in further pursuing it by watching some of those Bright Talk videos. And again, that's something that you can do without any cost. Okay. Another question, are certifications more recognized like security or CASP? Right, so there's all sorts of certifications. There's CEAS, the Certified Ethical Hacker. I would say this, again, those certifications are good, but you want to balance them with real world and hands-on experience as well. One of the challenges in the cybersecurity domain is that it changes very, very rapidly. So in order to stay up to date, you constantly have to stay on top of what's happening with the latest trends. So if you love learning, cybersecurity is a great discipline to be in. And of course, the demand for cybersecurity talent is very high. So looking for companies, organizations across Singapore, across the world, are all starved for cybersecurity. So in terms of job security, cybersecurity is a good choice as well. The cost of that, of course, is that you really have to have a continuous learning mindset because things change very, very rapidly, almost from month to month in the cybersecurity domain. Okay, I think that is all of the questions that I have seen come in. So if you have any other questions, feel free to type them in. If not, maybe I will wrap up the session. I'd like to say again, thank you to Singapore Institute of Management. Thank you to the organizers for the ability to talk and share with you today. I hope you found this information useful and learned something from it. And best of luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Steve Ledzian, once again for your advice on the importance and how we can stay cyber safe. We're moving on to the last item of the agenda of the Digital Banking Symposium. First steps into the world of fintech, machine learning, and AI. We have 4 speakers with us. Patrice Chung, Director, School of Infocom Technology, Ngee Polytechnic. Eileen Na, Head of OCBC Leadership, Future Smart and Customer Experience Faculties, OCBC Bank. Jeanette Uy, Data Science Lead, ASEAN, Solution Engineering Lead, Singapore, Oracle Corporation, and Chia Hock Lai, CEO, SwitchNovate, and President of the Singapore FinTech Association. They will be sharing practical tips such as what skill sets to pick up to stay relevant in your current or future job. The session will be starting shortly at 4 p.m. So once again, do click on the next session button located below, and I will see you over on the next program.